If you've spent any time in community spaces, in support groups, or even just scrolling through social media, you'll have probably run into the phrase that this is a safe space. And I used to use it a lot. I used to say my house is a safe space. You know, I've said it so many times and I really genuinely meant it. And it's a really beautiful sentiment and it's said in the best intentions. And it comes from a desire to protect people who've already been profoundly hurt. But lately, I've just been sitting with a really uncomfortable truth. Because if you look around our culture right now, the phrase is everywhere. We see massive nationwide campaigns on our high streets. There are billboards reminding us that thousands of banks, doctor surgeries and pharmacies are now designated official safe spaces where domestic abuse survivors can seek refuge. Those structural safety nets are created with good intentions and can be really important, and physically they can provide a vital, life-saving line of defence. But I feel like we've made a fundamental mistake by transferring that exact same word, safe, into the internal, invisible landscape of trauma and grief. You can lock a door to make a room physically safe and secure. But you can't lock a door to keep an emotional threat out of a wounded mind. I've come across schools that use isolation for when a child's dysregulated and their behaviour isn't manageable. They will isolate them. To some trauma survivors, that is just absolutely traumatising and doesn't fit the purpose that they're put in there for. An emotionally safe space is a myth. It's an impossible promise. And by pretending that we can guarantee safety to someone who's navigating trauma or deep loss, we might actually be setting them up for another layer of disappointment and pain. So now let's just look closer at those designated spaces in particular. The pharmacies, the clinics, the doctor surgeries. The institutional assumption is that once a building displays a safe space logo, it automatically becomes a sanctuary. But trauma survivors know a terrifying truth that institutions consistently overlook. Perpetrators don't exist in a vacuum. They hold jobs, they have families. What happens when the perpetrator or a member of their family or close network works inside that very surgery or pharmacy? What happens when the person behind the counter or the clinician holding the files is tied directly to the abuse? Suddenly that designated safe space becomes the most dangerous room in the building. When institutions turn safety into a procedural checkbox, they filter out the complex, messy and terrifying reality of how abusers operate. They create a false sense of security that can actually put a survivor at greater risk. You can't guarantee safety simply by putting a sticker on a window. Now let's look at the shaky ground of trauma and loss. To understand why emotional safety is an illusion, we have to also look at what trauma and profound loss can actually do to a human being. They aren't separate boxes. They can be deeply interlinked. Loss can be violently traumatic, and trauma is almost always a grief over the life, the safety, or the version of yourself that you lost when the trauma happened. When your life is shattered, you lose your baseline sense of predictability. The world as you knew it instantly vanishes. In its place is an entirely new, exhausting landscape that is barely recognisable, where the ground that you're walking on is just permanently shaky. And when you're living on that shaky ground, your nervous system is rewired. Trauma forces you into permanent hypervigilance. You're constantly scanning the horizon for the next emotional earthquake. And the irony is that even the very language we use in the trauma and recovery sector can traumatise us and betray us. We talk constantly about triggers. You know, what does that do to someone who's experienced trauma to do with guns? You know, for many survivors, that word is a trigger in itself. You know, it can bring up associations of violence, weapons, and sudden threat. You know, and when someone says, okay, just let you know, here's a trigger warning, it can instantly make a survivor feel blamed or hyper aware or detached from their own human response. Because they go, oh, it's okay, I've been warned, it's a trigger warning. But actually, yeah, it's triggering itself. It isn't a word that protects. Whether we use that word, whether we use, oh, flashpoint or wave or content warning, you know, these involuntary hijacks of the body and mind are completely unpredictable. You know, they can drag your nervous system back through time, forcing you to relive feelings that you've experienced in the absolute worst moments of your life. And anything can cause it. It could be like the way someone tilts their head and looks at you, or the tone of voice, or maybe a word that's used in passing, a scent, or maybe even like a sudden silence in a busy room. You know, so if I was hosting a space, how can I possibly protect you from that? You know, I don't know all your history. I don't know the exact architecture of your trauma, or even the specific shape of your grief or griefs. You know, I can ban certain words and I can set strict guidelines. I can't sanitise the world enough to guarantee that your nervous system won't feel threatened. You know, so when we tell a survivor or someone who's grieving that you're safe here, and then their body goes into a massive, overwhelming panic response 5 minutes later, can you imagine the isolation they feel? You know, they think something's wrong with them. You know, this is supposed to be a safe space, and why do I feel like I'm suffocating or I need to run right now and get out of here? You know, that promise of safety accidentally gaslights the very person who we're trying to help feel safe, you know, and they don't necessarily feel safe. Right now, every local council and university and corporate institution is rolling out trauma-informed frameworks. They're trying to turn human suffering into an administration task. But you know, how do you proceduralise a broken heart or a shattered nervous system? Like, so what can we do? You know, if we can't offer absolute safety, do we just give up? Well, no, we can offer something much more resilient. We can trade the myth of a safe space for the actual reality of an honest space, or what some call a brave space. Now, an honest space doesn't make false promises, and it doesn't tell you that the ground won't feel shaky, that you won't feel uncomfortable, or that the system's perfect. Instead, it says that the ground probably is going to shake here and there, but when it does, you don't have to pretend it isn't. You know, in a culture obsessed with keeping things neat and in boxes, we expect people to perform recovery. We want to tell them that, you know, tell your story, but there's got to be a silver lining. so it doesn't make everyone else in the room feel uncomfortable. But an honest space destroys that expectation. It's a space where you are allowed to show up completely undone. You know, if you're angry, you can be angry. And if you're holding yourself together by just a thread, you don't have to hide it and pretend that you're doing fine. We stop trying to fix the unfixable and we start learning how to just sit with the mess. Instead, let's stand together on this shaky ground. We can't build a room or a life free of pain or risk. And trauma and loss can change the landscape permanently. And pretending otherwise doesn't help any of us heal. So let's stop chasing the illusion of safety and start building spaces of true solidarity. We might all be standing on variables of incredibly shaky ground for one reason or the other. You know, carrying weights that nobody else in the room can see. But we don't have to stand there alone. And we don't have to lie to each other about how much it hurts. I'd like to know, how do you feel about this? Have you ever felt the pressure, you know, in a designated safe space to be okay, you know, or to hide how you're actually feeling because you didn't actually feel safe? Has something happened in a safe space room that made you think, I never want to be in a safe space again? You know, how do we build better, more honest spaces for each other? You know, let's start having those conversations in the comments. Have them in your living rooms, have them with your friends. Have them in places when someone tells you this is a safe space. Maybe say to them, actually, is it? Because we don't know everyone in the room and we don't know everyone's traumas and what may make it feel unsafe. Thank you for sitting with me, and please, if you haven't already, subscribe, join the conversations, join the community. Let's talk about grief and trauma. And I can't promise this is a safe space, but I can promise I will be as honest with my feelings as possible. Thank you.